So hi everybody, I'm Hadass Segal. I'm a psychotherapist and screenwriter, and I run film discussion groups here in Sydney, Australia. I'm really pleased to be part of this year's Sydney South African Film Festival. And joining me from Cape Town is Jenna Bass, writer and director of the powerful, engaging mind bend of a film that you just watched. Hi, Jenna.
Hi. Hi.
So
Nice to meet
I'm just going to introduce you. Jenna is a director, writer, and photographer who lives in Cape Town. She's a graduate of AFTER Film School who's worked as a director, writer, cinematographer, photographer, and appropriately for anyone who makes films, she's also worked as a magician. She's directed short films, music videos, and features. And in terms of genre, her work has run a spectrum of sci-fi, experimental, teenage coming of age, and historical magical realism. And she co-wrote last year's Kenyan Khan headline grabber, Rafiki. So that's quite an amazing CV. So Jenna, this is your third feature, and it has a kind of biblical, mythical quality to it, starting with the priest talking about Adam and Eve and God's plan. What inspired your story?
That's always a really hard question for me to answer because I began working on the story about 10 years ago or so when I'd finished film school, and I was really looking for what was going to be my big feature film that was going to start off my career and encapsulate all my influences from Apocalypse Now to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I had a very different view of cinema than I think I do now. And at the time, I had recently visited the Karoo and thought, oh wow, like this is such a great environment for a Western. Wouldn't it be great to set a South African Western here? And it really wasn't a lot more complicated than that. At the start, but over 10 years, a lot of things happened and my perspective changed a lot, and I changed a lot as a person, I think. And so what inspired the film ended up being a lot more complicated than just this very simple idea of a Western set in the Karoo. I started to incorporate a whole lot of questioning that I had about Westerns and why I wanted to make a Western in the first place and why there were no women in Westerns, and my changing views on South Africa. So it's actually it's hard a question to answer because it was very organic, the process of writing the film.
And I will ask you some deeper questions about that, because Flatland's really been called a feminist milestone in South Africa, where genre film is often the realm of kind of boys and men. When I was watching the film, I thought Natalie would kill Bucky's on her wedding night, and then she does one better and kills the patriarch priest. Poppy talks about blowjobs as a means of achieving equality, and Beauty says you can't be a man in this country, even the men are fucked. Bucky's and Branko and Tiernas are only interested in rugby and rough sex. So you're obviously playing with some ideas there about gender and power. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Sure. Again, also a complicated question. There's a lot that I could say. It started from, I think, deciding I wanted to make a Western and then watching a lot of Westerns. My dad's always been a major fan of Westerns and was always trying to get me as into them as he was. And eventually I did. I started watching lots of Westerns and got really excited about the genre. It was always something that realized that was because I could never see myself in these characters and in these stories. I always wanted to know, this is such a cool genre and there's so much exciting, narrative potential, but what would I do if I was there? And what would someone like me do in that situation where, Clint Eastwood's being, pulled across the desert by by his enemy, and what is he going, what would I do if I was in that situation? So I started to think about that and ask myself why this particular genre was so particularly male dominated, and what would change about the genre if that was not to be the case, and started to kind of delve deeper into that, and immediately started to encounter, when we were pitching the film and trying to get it financed, a lot of resistance, people saying, oh, well, it isn't a Western because, there's never really given me a good reason for why it wasn't a Western, but basically because it was, women instead of men. And I really can't believe that that's the defining factor for the genre. I mean, that would be very ridiculous. So, I really wanted to explore what would happen to the genre and the conventions of the genre, and how we could stick within that and also push those boundaries when we cast women as the main characters, and not just as carbon copies of the male characters that we usually see in westerns, but as fully realized, female characters. And the intention was never particularly to show men in a bad light per se. I don't really know it, again, because it was such a long organic process. It's always hard to say, like, what was my intention with this character, because it really evolved over so much time. But yeah, I suppose I wanted to show different kinds of male characters that I hadn't seen in films as much before. And I wanted to show that everybody has strengths and weaknesses and is morally ambiguous. So even the characters you might consider, the baddies of the film, they, I'll often have people coming up to me afterwards and being like, I don't understand why Bucky's is my favorite character. The guy is a rapist. Why on earth do I like him? And like, I think that's very much what we wanted to do with the movie, was to kind of show that everyone's a bit more complicated than we.
Absolutely. Yes, that moral ambiguity that you talk about. So I was thinking when I saw this first that, South African playwright Athol Fugard, who I'm sure you know, was heralded as deeply political, but he always used to say, I don't write about race or politics, I write about characters. And I think each of your characters is really inherently political too. We have Natalie and Poppy, whose relationship is based on Natalie sharing her late mother with Poppy, whose family employed her as a nanny and an implied wet nurse. And then you subvert that wonderful jingoistic phrase when Branko says the women in his wallet are his rainbow nation. So tell me about your ideas of race and politics in the film.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, as you can probably tell. I think that, South Africa is very much like a litmus test of the complexity of politics globally, but we do have it in a particularly complex, messy, but also very clear way here, which I find, like, I can't make a film that's set in South Africa without portraying that in some way and showing the intersections between all these different factors and how they influence daily life and everyday conversations, because they do, in my experience. And any kind of portrayal of everyday life that doesn't deal with that is either, is either, blinding itself to that, or is, woefully ignorant. So it's just very natural for me to kind of put, the views that I have of the country and the experiences that I've had and experiences that I've heard about other people having into the film, and to question a lot of the official narratives that are often associated with South Africa. I suppose the Rainbow Nation being, kind of an obvious example, but especially because we're a country with so many official, very strong official narratives. And then as a storyteller myself, really questioning those and asking ourselves, why are these the stories that we're always told and we're telling over and over again? Surely stories are more complicated than that, and there's often more than one story depending on which angle we look at it. So I think all my films kind of subscribe to that in some way, and are always going to have these different layers of all the different politics and aspects of politics that influence society.
Absolutely, and it beautifully subverts the narrative in that way, the dominant narrative. Now, the flatland of the title is the Karoo, as you said. You visited the Karoo, and it's a semi-desert in the heart of South Africa. It's a place Natalie's mom said is so flat you can see your future rolling in. What were some of the challenges and rewards of working in that very harsh location?
It was wonderful, really. I think, the hardest aspect of it was, the fact that it was just, very far from home for most of the people that were working on the film, and everyone, had to leave behind family and some comforts and things like that. But we also did work with a lot of people from the area as well. And I think everyone was just, who came from Cape Town or Johannesburg to work on the movie, was just like really, really blown away by the hospitality that we experienced from local Beaufort West and Karoo people. People went beyond out of their way to help us to be, and were enthusiastic about the film. And I mean, in some ways, I think it was easier than shooting in Cape Town, because everyone was just so excited to help and be involved, and it was such a treat for people to work on the movie, and that enthusiasm, obviously, it's really helpful for everyone else who's maybe more jaded and, this is our job. So it was I think if you asked David, the producer of the film, about that, he would probably have a longer list of problems that came with shooting there. But as far as I'm concerned, it was really wonderful, and it was really a privilege to be able to shoot there and to be so welcomed by the community.
Amazing. I mean, it appeared that a lot of the extras casting was done. I mean, my perception is it was done with locals rather than actors because they just seemed so authentic. Is that accurate?
Yeah. No, we wanted to obviously involve people, and we held a audition in Beaufort West for people to be involved in the film, and it was just so many people came, and it was just such a wonderful experience. Like, we really wanted to. I don't know. It didn't feel right to me to just come and transplant a whole bunch of people and make a film there. Like, I really did, even if weren't necessarily casting all the roles from that area, I really did want people to feel involved and that it was their film as well. And to some extent, hopefully we achieved that. But it was a really great aspect of making the film.
Amazing. So I wanted to ask about a few technical things. You have frequent close-ups that kind of create this kind of conscious claustrophobia. And the lighting is also magical. A lot of the time we see Natalie, particularly as she starts to evolve and get her freedom, we see her shot in these soft hues with these sunsets. It's clear you have a background in photography. How did you work with cinematographer Sarah Cunningham to create the look of the film?
So Sarah came from the UK, and someone I hadn't worked with before. So it was a really interesting experience getting to know each other and figuring out how each other worked. But I felt like Sarah, from me when we first started talking about the film, she really understood what I wanted to achieve with it, and she was very, very open to the way that I work and the way that I think a lot of directors probably also work like this, where I'll often kind of set a set of rules or principles for how I want the film to work. And in this case, I wanted Beauty's story and Natalie's story to look and feel very, very different. So even from the first kind of shot of the scene, you would almost know which world you were in and how that would be interesting, as obviously, as you know from the film, the two stories eventually converge, and how we could visually show the way that these two characters influence each other by the fact that these two cinematographic styles start to combine. So we kind of thought that through in a lot of ways, of how Natalie's aesthetic would differ from Beauty's, and just in a couple of kind of key points would be that Beauty's shots were always very steady and static and composed, whereas Natalie's was far more like a little bird, like hopping around it with attention kind of going to all the little details, and being much more handheld and fluid. So having different color schemes as well. So and then bringing those together later in the film to show how the two characters are impacting each other.
Yes, I mean, Beauty is, she's the antidote to any darkness in the film. She's that powerful in her pink velour, and she hates missing her soapies. But she's enmeshed in this complex relationship with a murderer whom she adores with a kind of surprising guilelessness. I actually thought that their relationship was the sweetest in the film. It had a kind of sweetness to it. So tell me how you created her character, her relationship with Billy Dacres, and also how you wrote and shot that deliciously wicked soap opera.
Okay, so to say is that the soap opera is not my creation at all. So that's a very popular, like probably one of the most popular soap operas in South Africa, called Generations. So yeah, I typically have nothing to do with it. I think it's our longest running soap opera, and it's like super, super popular. So it's something that in South Africa people would automatically recognize the characters, and so cannot claim credit for that at all. But I had wanted to use that. We were very, it was quite difficult, and took a lot of effort from the producing side to kind of get access to those clips. But I'm really glad we did, because I really wanted to reference something that was actually part of South African popular culture and not something that was a kind of facsimile of that. She also very much stemmed from writing a character who I wanted to see in a film, who I felt like I hadn't seen. I thought that she was, I wanted to see an action film or a genre film or a Western film with a character like Beauty as the star, and I just felt like I'd never really seen that, with some very minor, like vaguely similar exceptions. So it was really writing a character that I got excited about and that I wanted to see in that role. In terms of the relationship, I mean, a lot of the film is funny because in a lot of ways it is obviously hugely different from my life and anything that I've experienced, but there's also a lot of myself in it. And I think particularly when it comes to the relationships between the characters, there's a lot of me and my experience in that. And so I think, especially with Billy and Beauty's relationship, there's a lot of me in there and like my experience. And it's also why I find it so funny. Their relationship is often one of also the most divisive things about the film, because I've had people come up to me and afterwards and say, like, I just could not understand what Beauty saw in this guy, you know, like he's so clearly terrible, and why is she going to all this trouble? And about other people saying, you know, there's such a romantic relationship and it's so beautiful and sweet, as you say. So for me, I see it as quite romantic, but I can also see the problems in it. So yeah, I really think it's also, yeah, it's really, I guess that means that it's accurate and
very human, right? Very human. Beauty actually tells Billy that there's an interesting line where she says this country is not responsible for him killing his brother. So there's a lot of text and subtext about whether South Africa is to blame for the choices of the characters, or whether personal responsibility plays a bigger part. Is there something specific you were wanting audiences to kind of get from that?
Yeah, I guess nothing like straightforward. I suppose for me, I was actually saying this to someone the other day, like I prefer films that ask questions, and not necessarily ask questions, not to say it ask questions without any kind of sense of answer, but ask questions which the audience can begin to answer for themselves after having watched it. And so it's to raise these ideas and to kind of plant the seeds of the questions in people's brains while they're watching the film. Because I definitely think there isn't a clear answer to that question. And I think it's something that, you know, we're dealing with in lots of different ways. It's like how much of our contemporary, you know, reality in South Africa is as a result from the past, of the past, and how much of it is the choices that we're making in the present and the choices that we're making in terms of planning for the future. And these things are not separable, and they can't be looked at as separate. They're all connected. And a lot of the obsession with the past, and at the same time the kind of amputation of the past that we experience in South Africa, I think we've taken like a lot of the times we've taken like the worst of both worlds, and we don't necessarily look at the past for what it really is. So yeah, kind of really posing these questions for the complicated questions that they are, I think.
Great. Yes, it certainly left me with a sense of many questions. And I'd love to talk to you all night, but I'm aware that we have to wrap up. So the last thing I wanted to ask you was, you know, the Afrikaans language that's spoken in the film is so colourful and visceral. And I'm imagining that apart from the nuance of this language, there might be things that Australian audiences would have missed. Is there anything you think that you need to tell us Aussies that we may have missed?
You know, there's lots of things, I'm sure. I mean, it's a thing that we always, I mean, I'm sure, you know, filmmakers coming from non-Western spaces are always kind of dealing with this thing of how much do we explain and how much do we make accessible to an international audience and how much do we not. And I think, you know, a lot of the time there's, you know, we find ourselves taking up lots of space within the film doing that explaining work, and it's often to the detriment of the film itself. So I think I personally am always trying to find a balance between not alienating international audiences or Western audiences, and then at the same time, you know, not necessarily taking our time from the story to explain. So yeah, I think, you know, the film is what it is, and I think there's always going to be ways of reading it that are more, you know, specific to the South African audiences than to international audiences. Sorry, this is not the best answer to this question, but I suppose what I would say is that it just reminds me of, I was in Sweden recently with the film, and afterwards someone came up to me and said, you know, oh, I didn't know anything about South Africa, and I have so many questions for you about South Africa now. And I was like, oh gosh, here we go, like they're going to ask me to explain everything. And he was like, yeah, no, I'm just going to go on the internet now and research South Africa because I'm so interested. And so yes. I think that's the best thing to say is, like, if you do have questions, like, go find out. Like, I think that's the wonderful thing about cinema, and there will be things that you don't understand. That's absolutely fine, and that's great because you can find that out and you can still realize how much you don't know. So yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a final question, just because I was left wondering, and I know you're not going to answer this, but if we were to see Natalie in 10 years time, do you have a fantasy of where she'd be?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because when we're working on the film, the cast and I think a couple of the other crew members were always talking about like, we want a sequel, like we want to know what's going to happen with the characters, you know, in the next 10 years, or what would they do next. And yeah, so many things were kind of thrown around, you know, in that respect, in terms of, you know, brainstorming like what people would like to see of these characters. But I think everything that kind of comes up is that I think there's reason to think that these characters found happiness, even if it came with a lot of additional challenges and hardships. I mean, that's a general answer, but yeah, something along those lines I would think would be right.
Great. So Jenna Bass, on behalf of the Sydney South African Film Festival, thank you so much for talking with me.
A pleasure. Thank you for the questions.